It's hard to put it into words, but it's even harder to believe that I experienced it firsthand, and I can only hope to convey it to you the way that it happened to me. My folks owned some land up in the Appalachians where I grew up, and I was always in the woods hunting with my dad. I don't think we ever missed a hunting season. Whether it was small game or big game, we were there for it all. I was always aware of the myths and legends that went along with living in that area. If something whistles at you in the dark, don't whistle back. Close your curtains before nightfall, and if you hear your name being called, don't answer it. But all the times we were in the woods hunting, I never heard anything out of the ordinary, and I never become fearful of being in the woods. This hunting season was set up to be like all the rest. My dad and I got all the blinds and everything we needed together so we could set out early the next morning. I made the decision just to camp out on my folks' property, and I was going to meet up with my dad early the next morning before daylight. I'd say an hour or so before dusk, I went a few miles up into the woods to set up camp. I made my fire, set out my chair, and set up my tent. Night fell and I had my fire going pretty good to knock off the chill and to keep stuff away from me so I might be able to get a couple hours of sleep. As I was sitting around the fire before bed, I could hear the noises in the woods coming to life. I heard all the scampering and smaller animals and insects. But then I heard something that I'd never heard all the time I lived there as a kid. A whistle. And then it sounded like two rocks being smashed together. I just sat there as still and as quiet as possible. The forest then fell silent. The small game moving across the floor of the woods stopped. Even the insects stopped making noises. I knew from experience that when there was a predator around, that kind of stuff would happen, but I'd never experienced anything like this. I started thinking back to all the things I'd heard about those mountains. I'm familiar with the stories of Bigfoot, and I've listened to encounters from others. I remember that many people say they hear whistles, wood knocks, and they have things thrown at them. I'm open-minded, but I'm skeptical because I've never had that type of experience, nor have I seen a Bigfoot. My mom and dad had never indicated to me that they had either. It was definitely something that I now plan to ask my dad the following morning. I sat there for probably another 30 minutes listening to everything around me. I didn't hear anything else out of the ordinary, so I climbed inside my tent. But when I went to zip it closed, the zipper was broken. I cursed it under my breath, but honestly, it wasn't that big of a deal. My fire was still going low, so I laid there and watched it for a while and then started looking up at the stars, and eventually I fell asleep. About an hour or so after I fell asleep, I woke up because I heard a sound. I'd left an empty soda can sitting on the cooler in my campsite, and something had just knocked it off. The can hit the ground, and it woke me up. I'm a pretty light sleeper, so it wasn't unusual for me to wake up in the middle of the night. I didn't really think much of it, though. I just figured it was the wind that had blown it over. But just as I was getting ready to drift back off to sleep, I heard footsteps. My first thought was that it was my dad making his way up, so I scrambled over to my watch, but it was only 2:30. There was no way that it was him. But I know that what I heard was footsteps. Something was clearly walking around my tent. It was definitely bipedal. Deer don't sound like that, and there's no way that a deer could be that heavy. As slowly and quietly as I could, I reached over to grab my pistol. My brain was still trying to process the sound of the footsteps, and I was trying to think of what it could be. And this overwhelming fear came over me. I'd never felt fear like that before in the woods. But there it was, and I'm not afraid to admit it. At 45 years old, I was scared shitless. My heart rate went up, and I started shaking. My adrenaline was kicking in. The footsteps got closer and closer, and I could hear the leaves crunching with every step. I steadied myself as much as I could, and I was getting ready to slowly leave the tent to get a closer look at whoever or whatever this was. Looking back, it probably wasn't a very good idea at the time, but I wanted to see if this was a person. In my experience, people are way more dangerous than animals, especially one that would sneak up on a person's tent in the middle of the night. When I sat up, I saw the glow of the fire casting shadows all around the camp. That's when I heard the footsteps come right up beside my tent. I froze. The only sound I could hear was the pounding of my own heart in my ears and the sound of whatever this was, breathing heavily. I quietly scooted back until my back was up against my tent. Now that broken zipper was a big deal, and I was really pissed off that I was unable to close the door. I knew that I was a sitting duck. Just like the deer we hunt, I was now prey for whatever this was. This thing stepped in between the fire and my tent. Its shadow was huge. That's when I realized this was something that had legs like a human, but it was way bigger than any man I'd ever seen. It was so close I could have reached out and grabbed it, or worse yet, it could have reached in and grabbed me. All I could do was sit there shaking, staring at this massive shadow and listening to it breathe. This had to be a Bigfoot. I looked down at the 9mm pistol I was holding and thought to myself, this might as well have been a BB gun. This thing took another step closer to the front door of my tent, and I thought to myself, this is how I'm going to die. I made peace with God and just waited for it to rip the tent off of me and either carry me off or kill me. But instead, it bent down and I heard it open the cooler that was sitting right next to my tent. I considered busting out of the tent and making a run for my parents while it was distracted. But my body was frozen in place and it felt like I was stuck to the ground. I couldn't move. I heard this thing huffing as it moved things around in the cooler. It took another half step and it was now standing at the front door of the tent. I could see its legs, and they were massive and muscular, and it was covered with hair, not fur. Then all of a sudden, it grabbed the top of my tent and started to shake it. I screamed out, and the shaking stopped when it heard me. That's when this thing bent over and looked inside my tent. I don't really know how to describe to you how I felt at that point. I just knew I was going to be another missing persons case. I was sure of it. This thing's head was probably 2 times the size of mine. The face looked like an ape, but at the same time, it looked human-like. It had a thick brow ridge, a flat nose, thin lips, and a very broad mouth. I still had my pistol in my hand, but I tell you, I couldn't shoot it. I just couldn't. A low rumble came from its chest, and then I felt instantly dizzy. I felt like I was going to be sick. And then I guess I blacked out. I don't remember anything after that. I woke up when I heard my dad yelling my name. It was after daybreak, and he was pissed. I crawled out of the tent and looked around to make sure this thing was gone. Thankfully it was. My cooler was still open and I could see that the things had been moved around, so I knew that that wasn't just an awful dream. I tried to explain it to my dad, but he said we'd just talk about it later. I obviously decided that I was not going hunting that day. To be honest, at that point, I didn't think I'd ever go back. My dad had hurt his back the following year, so he wasn't able to hunt, and I was fine with that. I know that some people are going to have strong opinions about these things, and I'm sure I'm going to catch some slack, and that's okay. I know what I experienced, regardless of what anyone says. I'm just glad that I lived to see another day. I have no idea why this thing didn't kill me, but I'm sure glad that it didn't. Thanks for listening, and thanks for all you do. John.